Imagine a world stirring from a long slumber. The grand edifice of the Roman Empire is a distant memory, its roads and aqueducts crumbling into legend. This is Europe at the dawn of the ninth century, a time we often paint with a single broad brushstroke, the Dark Ages. But to do so is to miss the fire and the fury, the birth of nations, the terror on the seas, and the brilliant light of knowledge burning brightly in faraway lands. The 100 years from 800 to 900 AD were not an age of darkness. They were a crucible, a violent, chaotic, and transformative century that shattered one empire, saw the rise of another, and laid the foundations for the world we know today. This is the story of that century, a story of emperors, Vikings, scholars, and kings. Our story begins on Christmas Day in the year 800. In the city of Rome, a towering figure knelt in prayer. He was Charles, King of the Franks, a brilliant military strategist, and a devout, if ruthless, Christian ruler. As he rose from his knees, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. This was more than a coronation, it was a statement. It was the declaration of a new Western Roman Empire, a Christian empire, reborn from the ashes. We know this man as Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. His Carolingian Empire was vast, stretching from the North Sea to central Italy, from the Atlantic to the plains of Hungary. Under Charlemagne, a flicker of light returned to Western Europe. He was more than a warrior, he was an administrator. He standardized currency, issued laws, and divided his vast empire into counties, each overseen by a loyal count. This created a semblance of central authority not seen since Rome's fall. But empires built by a single, force-of-nature personality are often fragile. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left his vast realm to his son, Louis the Pious. Louis was a capable ruler, but he lacked his father's overwhelming authority. He faced rebellions from his own sons, who were hungry for power and territory. The dream of a unified Christian empire began to crack. After Louis's death, his three surviving sons waged a bitter civil war. The conflict ended in 843 with the Treaty of Verdun, one of the most significant documents in European history. The empire was formally carved into three pieces. To Charles the Bald went West Francia, the kingdom that would, over centuries, evolve into France. To Louis the German went East Francia, the core of the future Germany. And to the eldest, Lothair, went the imperial title and a long, awkward strip of land in the middle, called Middle Francia, stretching from the Netherlands down to Italy. The Treaty of Verdun wasn't a solution, but a ceasefire born of exhaustion. The rivalry between the brothers didn't end. Lothair's Middle Francia, with no geographical or cultural unity, quickly fragmented upon his death, swallowed by its more powerful neighbors. The imperial title became a political football, passed between weak kings who commanded little real authority beyond their own lands. This constant infighting was a cancer at the heart of the empire. Kings focused on battling their cousins rather than protecting their realms. Power flowed away from the throne and into the hands of local strongmen, the dukes, counts, and margraves. These aristocrats, entrusted with defending the frontiers, began to act as independent rulers, building castles and commanding the loyalty of local warriors. This was the genesis of feudalism. In a world without effective central protection, security became a local affair. A peasant farmer or a monk didn't look to a distant, powerless king for safety. They looked to the nearest warlord with a stone tower and a retinue of armed men. Loyalty became personal, a pact between a warrior and his lord, not an allegiance to an abstract state. The grand imperial dream was dissolving into a patchwork of localized power. This Middle Kingdom would be a source of conflict for the next 1,000 years, a contested borderland fought over by France and Germany well into the 20th century. Charlemagne's dream of unity was dead. and as his grandson squabbled over the pieces, a new and terrible threat was gathering in the north. They came from the sea, from the fjords of Scandinavia, in ships with shallow draughts, dragon heads carved into their prows. We call them Vikings. To the people of 9th century Europe, they were simply the Northmen, a pagan terror that descended without warning. The Viking Age exploded in the 9th century. Their technological marvel, the longship, could navigate both the stormy open ocean and the shallowest of rivers. This gave them unparalleled mobility. They could strike deep inland, sacking towns and monasteries that had felt safe for generations. Paris, Hamburg, Seville all felt their wrath. The fractured Carolingian kingdoms were unable to mount a coordinated defense. Local lords were left to fend for themselves, often resorting to paying the Vikings to leave, a tribute known as the Danegeld. This, of course, only encouraged them to return for more. In 845, the Viking chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris, leaving only after being paid 7,000 pounds of silver. But the Vikings were not just mindless raiders. They were explorers, traders, and settlers. While some raided Francia, others sailed west, discovering and colonizing Iceland, a land of fire and ice previously uninhabited by humans. Others sailed east, down the great rivers of Russia, reaching the Black Sea and even Constantinople. They established trade routes and became the ruling class among the Slavic tribes, known as the Rus, from which the name Russia is derived. In England, they came not just to raid, but to conquer. In 865, a massive force known to the Anglo-Saxons as the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell, until only one remained. That last kingdom was Wessex, and its king was a man named Alfred. When Alfred took the throne in 871, he was a young man facing an existential threat. The Vikings had conquered half of England and seemed unstoppable. In the winter of 878, after a surprise attack, Alfred was driven into hiding in the marshlands of Somerset, his kingdom on the brink of annihilation. But Alfred did not despair. He rallied his forces and, in a decisive battle at Edington, defeated the Great Heathen Army. He secured a peace that partitioned England, creating a Viking-controlled territory known as the Danelaw. But Alfred's work was just beginning. He was more than a warrior. He was a visionary. He reorganized his army, built a navy, and established a network of fortified towns called boroughs to defend against future raids. He understood that military might was not enough. Like Charlemagne, he championed learning, translating key Latin texts into Old English himself so that his people could read them. Alfred's resilience not only saved his kingdom, but laid the groundwork for a unified England, earning him the title he alone holds in English history, Alfred the Great. But while Western Europe buckled, another Roman Empire still stood, powerful and unbroken. To the east, the Byzantine Empire, centered on its magnificent capital of Constantinople, was the true continuation of Roman power. Its emperors, direct successors to Augustus, ruled over a sophisticated, urbanized, and bureaucratic state that would have been unrecognizable to the Frankish kings. In the 9th century, Constantinople was the largest city in Christendom, a dazzling metropolis of palaces, churches, and bustling markets. While Charlemagne's court was a traveling war band, the Byzantine emperor presided over a complex civil service, collecting taxes and administering laws codified since the time of Justinian. They faced their own threats, from the Arab Caliphate and the rising power of the Bulgars, but they did so with a professional army and a centralized state. What was life like for the vast majority of people in this turbulent century? For a peasant in Francia or Wessex, life was short, hard, and dictated by the seasons. Most people were farmers, bound to the land owned by a lord. Their world was the village they were born in, and they might never travel more than 20 miles from it in their entire lifetime. They lived in small, smoky huts made of wood and wattle and daub, often sharing the space with their animals during the cold winters. Their diet consisted mainly of a thick vegetable stew called pottage, supplemented with coarse dark bread and weak ale. Meat was a rare luxury. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their lives governed by the planting and the harvest, and by the demands of their lord for rent, labor, and military service. Society was rigidly hierarchical. There was little concept of social mobility. You were born a peasant, a warrior, or a priest, and you were likely to die as one. Yet it was a world rich in community, tradition, and faith. The local church was the center of social life, its calendar of festivals and fasts giving rhythm to the year. It was a life of back-breaking labor and constant insecurity, but it was also one of deep-rooted custom and communal identity. While Europe was consumed by internal strife and external raids, a very different story was unfolding further east. In Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic Golden Age was at its zenith. This was the world's center of science, philosophy, and medicine. The Great Library of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, was a magnet for scholars from across the known world. They translated the works of Greek thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, into Arabic, preserving them for posterity. But they did not just preserve, they innovated. During the 9th century, the polymath Al-Khwarizmi pioneered algebra, a word derived from his book's title, Al-Jabr. He systematized the use of Hindu-Arabic numerals, the very numbers 0 through 9th we use today. Physicians wrote vast medical encyclopedias, astronomers mapped the stars with unprecedented accuracy, and engineers developed sophisticated new technologies. The contrast with the fragmented, struggling kingdoms of Western Europe could not have been more stark. As the 9th century drew to a close, the world was a vastly different place than it had been at Charlemagne's coronation. The Carolingian Empire was a shattered dream. In its place were the nascent kingdoms of France and Germany, their identities forged in opposition to each other and to the Viking threat. The Viking Age had reshaped the map, connecting Scandinavia to Russia, Iceland, and the British Isles through networks of trade and terror. Their ferocity forced Europe to adapt, contributing to the rise of a more militarized feudal society of castles and knights. In England, the idea of a single English identity had been born from the struggle for survival under Alfred the Great. And far away, the intellectual treasures of the ancient world were being kept safe, not in the monasteries of Europe, but in the libraries of Baghdad, waiting to be rediscovered. The 9th century was not an end. It was a violent, messy, and profoundly important beginning. It was the century that dissolved an old world and forged the building blocks of a new one, a period not of darkness, but of the painful, brilliant dawn of the modern West.